So let's take a look at the second one here. The second one here has 6x squared minus 11x plus 3. Common factor, there is no common factor between all of those. So I have to use decomposition because this is a complex trinomial. So right away, I'm going to write 6x squared. I'm going to write this plus 3 at the end, and I'm going to break up the negative 11x. So again, how do I break up the negative 11x? I use product of AC, sum, and integer. Now the product of AC is 6 times 3, which is 18. The sum of this thing is negative 11. So I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to positive 18, add to negative 11. And the only things that multiply to 18 is 1 times 18, 2 times 9, 3 times 6. So these are my choices. This will never add to 11, neither will that. The only thing that adds to 11 is this here. So the two proper numbers would be negative 2 and negative 9. Negative 2 times negative 9 is positive 18, and negative 2 plus negative 9 is negative 11. So I'm going to break up the two middle terms into negative 2x and negative 9x. You have to break it up the proper way, which is using product of AC, sum, and integer. Still, negative 2x minus 9x is still negative 11x. I've just broken it up appropriately. Now I will factor by grouping. Group the first two, group the second two. Grouping the first two, between those two things I can factor out a 2x. And if I factor out a 2x from this divided by 2x is 3x, this divided by 2x is negative 1. And between these two things, I'm going to factor out a 3, but not just a 3, a negative 3, because there's a negative right out here. And why did I do that? Because this divided by negative 3 gives me positive 3x, which is exactly the same as over there. And this divided by negative 3 is negative 1. Remember that in order for you to be doing this properly, the two brackets should be the exact same. So now, between those two brackets, the 3x minus 1 is in common. And if I factor it out from the first one, I'm left with 2x. Factor it out from the second one, I'm left with negative 3. So this is my final answer. Again, this is just a recap of grade 10. So if you are behind and you don't know how to do this, this should just be bringing back that, recall that information for you. If you do not know how to do this, you definitely have to go back and watch videos on decomposition, more videos on that. And you have to get good at doing complex trinomials because this entire unit is based on factoring and simplifying. So you're going to be factoring plenty of simple, complex trinomials, all sorts of things. So let's take a look at this one here. Again, this one here, it says 4x squared plus 16x plus 15. Now, there's no common factor between all of them, and it's a complex trinomial, so I have to use decomposition. Using decomposition, I'm going to leave the first term the same and the last term the same. What I'm going to do is break up the middle term. I have a process to break up the middle term using product of AC, sum, and integer. So this is the process to break up that middle term. And so product of AC is 4 times 15, which is 60, and the sum is 16. So this one's pretty obvious. The two numbers are 6 and 10. Okay, if it's not so obvious to you, you got to list the factors of 60. But 6 times 10 is 60, 6 plus 10 is 16. So those are the two numbers that I'm going to break up the middle term, positive 6x and positive 10x. People ask me all the time, does it matter which one you put first? No, it does not. If you put the 10x instead of the 6x first, you would still be factoring by grouping. You'll still get the right answer, but in a different way. Your brackets will be different than mine. So grouping the first two and the last two terms, between the first two terms, I can factor out a 2x. So I will first factor out a 2x from both of those. And what's left, this time divided by 2x is 2x, and this divided by 2x is positive 3. And then between these two things, I can factor out a 3. Actually, not a 3, a 5. So I can factor out a 5. So between those two things, this divided by 5 is 2x, and this divided by 5 is positive 3. Again, I know I'm doing this correctly because the two brackets look the same. Now, between these two things, it's this whole thing plus this whole thing. Between those two things, the bracket, the 2x minus 3, is the exact same. So I can factor out as a common factor that bracket. This, if I divide the bracket out from there, I'm just left with 2x. Divide the bracket out from there, I'm just left with plus 5. So this is the final answer. Again, if I re-expanded this, it would end up in that trinomial up there. So let's move on to some other factoring. So those are the big factoring problems. But then we got to doing factoring complex trinomials using the crisscross method. I'm going to actually come back to this in a later episode where I'll show you the crisscross method. So we'll actually skip that right now, and we'll come back to that in our notes when I do the crisscross method for you. And you'll see the crisscross method works in a different way, but you get the exact same answer. So let's take a look at factoring special products. So if you forgot special products, you definitely forgot these things. You have to understand special products. So I'll actually just pull up a blank screen here. And the first special product was a difference of squares. Now, a difference of squares. Number one, it has to be a difference. And number two, it has to be a perfect square. The numbers have to be perfect squares. Now, when we showed you stuff like this, x plus 5 times x minus 5, for instance. When you expanded this the proper way using FOIL, everything in here times everything in here, x times x is x squared, x times negative 5 is negative 5x, and then 5 times x is 5x, and 5 times negative 5 is negative 25. And then when you simplify this, the middle terms will cancel out because one's a negative 5x, one's a positive 5x. Add them together is 0. So you're just left with x squared minus 25. And this is a difference of squares. Why is this a difference of squares? Because this is a perfect square. The square root is just x. This is a perfect square. The square root is just 5. And there's a negative sign in the middle. So if you ever see something like this, it comes from two brackets that look exactly the same, except one has a plus, one has a minus. After doing so many of these, for instance, x plus 1 times x minus 1, you would have realized that there's actually a trick to multiplying these out. You already know that the middle term is going to be a negative x and a positive x, and they will cancel out. So what will be left is just the x times x, which is x squared, and the 1 times negative 1, which is negative 1. Because the middle term will be, one will be a negative 1x, one will be a positive 1x, and they'll cancel out. Again, it always ends up in a difference of squares. This is a sum and difference. Two brackets that look the same, except one has a plus, one has a minus. If you ever see a difference of squares, it came from two brackets that are the same, except one's a plus, one's a minus. So with that in mind, let's take a look at question A and B. Question A and B, if I take a look at this one here, question A, that says x squared minus 9. There's only two terms there. It's not a trinomial, it's just two terms. So then you ask yourself, is there a common factor? And the answer is no, there's no common factor. So is it impossible? No, it's not. You have to check to see if it's a difference of squares. Clearly, it's a difference of squares because number one, it's a difference in the middle. If it's not a difference, not a difference of squares. Can't do it. But there's a difference, and this is a perfect square. Square root is just x. That's a perfect square. The square root of that is just 3. So that means this came from two brackets that looked exactly the same, except one has a plus, one has a minus. Now what goes here and here? The square root of that, again, is x. So that's what goes here and here. And the square root of this is 3. So that's what goes here and here. If you re-multiply this out, you will get just those two terms because the middle term will cancel out. So you have to understand the difference of squares.